Welcome to episode 156 of OTD, your daily dose of soccer history by 17 Laws Guy. It's April 5, 1972. East Berlin, Friedrich Ludwig Jahn Sport Park. And today's story is about a match that looked, at first glance, almost symmetrical. Dynamo against Dynamo. Berlin against Moscow. Blue-blooded names from the same football family. But in Cold War Europe, that symmetry was false. Because Dynamo was not just a club name. It was a state label, a badge of power, a signal that football here did not belong only to the terraces in the dressing room. No, it belonged to ministries, to security organs, to systems. So when Dynamo Berlin and Dynamo Moscow met on this day in 1972 in the semi-finals of the European Cup Winners' Cup, this was not just a football tie behind the Iron Curtain. It was a meeting between the Soviet original and the East German offshoot, the mothership and the ambitious provincial branch. Two clubs from the same political ecosystem, carrying far more than football in their names. But how did we get here? We start with Europe after 1945. The continent is divided, not just by borders, armies, and ideologies, but by sporting systems. In the West, football is increasingly professional, commercial, and club-driven. In the East, it becomes centralized, state-managed, and politically useful. And in the early 1950s, before the Soviet model fully takes over the football imagination, Hungary becomes the great standard bearer. The mighty Magyars win Olympic gold in 1952. They beat England 6-3 at Wembley in 1953, then 7-1 in Budapest. They reach the 1954 World Cup final. And at club level, Honvéd, the army club, supplies much of the national team's spine, Puskás, Kocsis, Bostsik, and Szybor. If you want the full version of that story, go back to episode 50, because that is where we followed Honvéd, and the night 1956 broke that Hungarian world apart. Because then came 1956, the uprising, the tanks, the exodus, and in football terms, the transfer of prestige. Hungary's golden moment fractures. The Soviet Union rises harder into the foreground, and the Melbourne Olympics around the same time as the uprising in Budapest. The Soviets take gold, and the Eastern Bloc's great advantage becomes clearer. The fiction of state amateurs, players who were soldiers, policemen, or workers on paper, but full-time elite footballers in reality. We covered that turn in episode 24, and it matters here because it explains the ecosystem in which clubs like Dynamo Moscow could thrive. East Germany, meanwhile, is not yet at its peak in 1972. Its great decade still lies just ahead. Olympic bronze in Munich in 1972. Then the better-known peaks of the mid-1970s under Georg Buschner. For that longer East German arc, you can go back to episode 104. But even before East Germany fully arrives as a national team force, its clubs are already being shaped by the same logic. And that brings us to the communist football map. Not all socialist clubs were the same thing. CSKA meant army. Honvéd meant army. Red Star, especially in Yugoslavia, carried the symbolism of revolutionary legitimacy and anti-fascist youth. But Dynamo was something else. Dynamo meant the organs of internal order, police, security, intelligence, and state control. In the Soviet Union, the Dynamo Sports Association was created in 1923 in the orbit of the secret police. In East Germany, the Dynamo network belonged to the domestic security apparatus, and the Stasi was the dominant force within it. So when you say Dynamo Moscow, you're talking about one of the foundational clubs of the Soviet security sports system. And when you say Dynamo Berlin, you're talking about a club that, more than any other in the GDR, became to be identified with Erich Mielke, the Stasi chief who wanted a capital city showpiece. That is why this time matters. Dynamo Moscow were old, established, decorated, and central. Dynamo Berlin were newer, hungrier, politically backed, and explicitly meant to represent East Berlin, the capital at the front line of the Cold War. If there was a hierarchy, it existed before kickoff. Moscow were the elder brother. Berlin were the ambitious younger relative, trying to prove they belonged. Then football started doing its part. Dynamo Berlin did not enter this competition as East German champions. They got there because they reached the 1970-71 FDGB Pokal final, lost 2-1 after extra time to Dynamo Dresden, and still qualified because Dresden had already completed the domestic double. So Dynamo Berlin came into Europe by the side door. Dynamo Moscow arrived as Soviet Cup winners. Their path to the semi-final were impressive in different ways. Dynamo Berlin survived Cardiff City on penalties, beat Beerschot, then knocked out Åtvidaberg, and became the first Berlin club to reach the semi-finals of one of UEFA's two major competitions. Dynamo Moscow beat Olympiacos, then Eskişehirspor, then Red Star Belgrade, which matters because Red Star had been European Cup semi-finalists just a year earlier. So by April 1972, neither side had stumbled here by accident. This was the real semi-final. And now we arrive at the night itself. April 5, 1972, Friedrich Ludwig Jahn Sportpark, 30,000 in the ground. This was not sterile in the sense of an empty bowl and polite applause. This was the full house in East Berlin. What it was not, though, was the Western media circus. This was the major European tie, yes, but one played behind a curtain through which not everything passed equally. On the pitch, Moscow struck first. Gennady Yeruishkin, put Dynamo Moscow ahead, and for a while the script seemed obvious enough. The senior Soviet Dynamo, calmer and heavier with pedigree, taking control against the East German project. But Berlin did not fold. Norbert Johansen equalized from the penalty spot, and the match finished 1-1. And that score matters, because if anybody expected deference, there was none. If anybody thought this was ceremonial, it wasn't. If anybody suspected that the younger brother branch would quietly know its place, the scoreboard refused the idea. The first leg ended level. The crowd had seen a contest, not a pageant. And in a sense, that is the most revealing thing about the night. Politics framed it. Institutions hovered over it. The names meant something. But once the whistle blew, nobody could avoid the stubborn fact that football still had to decide it. But so what? Well, to begin with, this was only the first leg. 2 weeks later, the return was played not in Moscow, but in Lviv. And there again, Dynamo Berlin proved this tie was real. Wolf Rüdiger Netz put the East Germans ahead. Yeruishkin equalized for Dynamo Moscow. The tie stayed level across both legs, and only a penalty shootout finally sent Moscow through. That alone should kill any lazy idea that this was choreographed hierarchy. The original Soviet Dynamo needed penalties to get past the East German one. Dynamo Moscow then went all the way to the final in Barcelona. They became the first Soviet club ever to reach the European final. And there, they lost 3-2 to Rangers in one of the strangest, most chaotic finals of the era. Well, that's an OTD story for a different day, obviously. So this semi-final in East Berlin was not some obscure cul-de-sac. It was the gateway to a continental first for Soviet club football. The longer arc for Dynamo Berlin is fascinating because in 1972, they were not yet what later memory made them. Today, many people hear Dynamo Berlin and think immediately of the Stasi club that won 10 straight East German league titles from 1979 to 1988. But on this night in 1972, that empire didn't exist yet. This was the climb, not the peak. They were becoming stronger, better resourced, more central to East German football, but not yet the domestic machine they would later become. In that sense, this tie catches Dynamo Berlin in a more interesting moment, still rising, still proving, still chasing legitimacy on the field, rather than simply exerting it at home. And after 1989, the whole world that had created that club collapsed. The wall fell. The Stasi vanished. Dynamo Berlin quickly shed the Dynamo name and became FC Berlin, trying to escape the stain. But the state backing, the pipeline, the political muscle, all of that was gone. Dynamo Moscow survived the end of the Soviet Union more recognizably because the brand was older and larger. But even there, the old world had gone. The name remained, the system didn't. And that wider point goes beyond the two Dynamos. You can see it with CSKAs. You can see it with the Red Stars. Some adapted better than others. Red Star even conquered Europe in 1991, just as Yugoslavia itself was beginning to come apart. CSKA Moscow later won a UEFA Cup in a very different age, under very different economics. But the common thread is this. Once communism fell, the old state sport ecosystem fell with it. And nowhere is that clearer than the Olympics. The cleaner explanation for Eastern Europe losing its grip on Olympic football is not some vague theory about chemistry. It is structure. State amateurism stopped being a winning loophole once professionals were admitted in 1984, and later, once the men's tournament became under 23 from 1992, the game changed, the political advantage evaporated. So this match sits at a hinge. Hungary's great early 50s era is already gone. The Soviet club machine is still powerful enough to reach a European final. East Germany's great national team decade is just beginning to form, and all of it is still being played under the grammar of the Cold War. Before we go, 3 things to take away from April 5, 1972. First, Dynamo was never just branding. It signaled a relationship to the security state, and that gave this semifinal a political charge no Western tie could quite replicate. Second, this was not a sham. 30,000 watched a real contest in East Berlin, and across 2 legs that teams could not be separated without penalties. And third, this time matters because it sits between eras, after Honved and Hungary, but before East Germany's full flowering, and just as Soviet club football touched a new European height. On this day in 1972, Dynamo Berlin and Dynamo Moscow drew 1-1 in East Berlin in a Cold War semi-final between 2 clubs carrying the same name, the same system, and very different weights of power. That's all for episode 156 of OTD, your daily dose of soccer history by 17 Lost Guy. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow the show, leave a 5-star rating, and share it with a football friend. Tomorrow, go to April 6, 1996, when Major League Soccer finally kicked off and the United States took its first durable step toward a real top-flight soccer culture. See you then.